Hello, everyone, and welcome to Live Long and Pastor. My name is Josh Ziefel, Dean of the College of Ministry here at Northwest University. And our goal, as every time in this podcast, is to learn more about ministry from pastors who are doing the work of ministry. And along the way, we hope you'll be invigorated, challenged, and for those of you pastors listening in, encouraged towards longevity in ministry as you live Jesus' calling in your life. So we're here today, and my guest today is Dr. Verlon Fosner. Hello, Dr. Fosner. How are you, Verlon?
Well, I'm doing well, Josh. How are you doing?
I am great. You and I, actually, it's funny. I feel like you and I have had this conversation about dinner church a number of times, but I've never recorded it. So now we get to record it and everybody else benefit from it. Verlon, Dr. Fosner, and this is from the internet, so it's going to sound like a copywriter wrote it, but he leads an innovative congregation in Seattle, Washington, and has done so since 1999. And since then, and in the last decade or more, the congregation has transitioned from a traditional proclamation-based church into a multi-site dinner church model called community dinners. We're going to unpack all of the details of what that is, what that means, what that looks like, and ask some questions along the way. But first, and I've already prepped him for this, so he's thought about it. Verlon, I have to ask you, if you had to choose a fictional character to describe yourself as a pastor, somebody from television, film, novels, etc., who would it be and why?
Well, I have a couple that are vying for my attention. One is I think you said the Gimli character, who is one of the Lord of the Rings that
Okay.
is finding his way in rather dark and strange caves and forests and all of that
Okay.
kind of
Yeah.
thing, because I feel like that's explained our ministry for the last number of years, especially. Another one is the Brad Pitt in Moneyball, in the scene where he
Okay.
is trying to completely reinvent the way baseball is
Yeah.
played, the
Yeah.
Oakland A's story. And everyone thinks he's nuts. And there's the points in the middle where he thinks he's nuts. What am I doing? So I watch that movie, I think, once a year. It's about time for me to watch it again. Just with that scene, why am I doing this? As he's by himself in his truck talking to himself. I can just relate with that so many times.
Well,
Yeah.
that's actually really interesting. I think certainly as we begin to talk about the dental church and community dinner model, I think that, yeah, I can see that a lot. Well, before we get to that, though, obviously the kind of ministry you've been doing for the last 25 years or so is not, I suspect, the kind of ministry you grew up in, nor the kind of ministry you were trained for initially. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your call to ministry and your journey into ministry in the first place. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I sure can. Goodness sakes, I was a young boy when I felt my first tug on my heart to follow my father in pastoral ministry. And I was not that long later, I was probably 7 years of age when our city came up to Seattle for kind of a peacekeeping mission with my sister, who had kind of ran off on a bit of a rebellious trail. And so
Okay.
we came up to say, hey, all is well. We're all still family.
Yeah.
We're all good here. But
Yeah.
while we were there, I woke up in the middle of the night, sleeping on the couch on Capitol Hill, looking out over the all of the ambulances and the people. I mean, the sidewalks. It's midnight and they're just loaded with people, and
Yeah.
it just buried something deep in me that one day I'm going to give myself to this city and give myself to a place that never sleeps. And
Hmm.
this
Yeah.
mass, and coming from where we live, that was very different. So
Now, did you grow up?
fast
Was
forward.
it a rural area you grew up in?
Yeah, yep. I grew up in Klamath Falls, Oregon. It's not the
Okay.
end of the world, but you can see it from there. So we definitely had the slow pace, and it wasn't me. The whole time I was growing up, this isn't me. The city is, and so fast forward to now I've pastored in three or four different churches, but man, I just never get that city thing to go away. So we were flying over Seattle, going to an interview in another non urban. It was a full on suburban interview up here. And the clouds parted. I looked right down into the city and I just said, why am I going to this other interview? That's where I'm supposed to be. And so that interview turned out, I think, to probably be the worst interview in the history of ministerial candidacy. Both for them, I think I disappointed them at a greater rate than they even disappointed me. It just wasn't right. So, man, we landed, the phone rang literally a couple days later, and we're back up to Seattle with this
Wow.
church, which was
Okay.
just the Lord's divine steering.
Well, if you feel bad about an interview, not too long ago, I was at a job interview and I was at a dinner with the people that were going to be interviewing me. And for some reason, I thought it was a great idea to order ribs. So I'm like trying to talk to them and like eating. It was, folks, if you're interviewing for a job, don't eat ribs. It was also, spoiler, I didn't get the jobs. There you
They
go.
didn't like the way you ate ribs?
Well, it's just a
Yeah.
messy food. So, yeah. So, anyway, so you came to Seattle, and this would have been later 90s, mid later 90s,
1999. Yeah,
1999. And
99,
the
right.
church that you came in to lead, to be the pastor of, was a traditional
It was, yeah.
church, right? So tell me a
Yeah,
little bit
yeah.
about the church that you walked into.
Yeah, a very historic church. We were the first church, AG church, planted in the city, the first Pentecostal church planted in the city way back in the 90s. And the church had always done really well. It was doing good when we took it, and for the next 4 or 5 years, it just continued to grow and set attendance records and do really well until it was like the wheels just came off the wagon. And like literally in a week, the momentum just drained out of the church. You could just feel it. And yet the staff, we all had our foot on the gas still. We still felt like we were doing everything we'd ever been trained, best practices, everything was our goal, and our staff
Yeah,
meetings are all built around that. And but what was happening, and what I did not understand, was there was an urban ring that was coming over our church. So our church was moving from suburban realities to a lot more urban realities, and we were still there, but the people, the population was changing, and we're still operating from a different mindset. That was a massive turning point for us, or it needed to be, or else we were going to go into, hospice as a church. So yeah,
if you kept
that was
doing the same things over and over again, you were going to have diminishing returns and it was going to be over.
yeah.
In other words,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. In fact, I actually published at one point that our church is going to go out of business by November of 2011, just on the rate of declines that we had experienced. If this keeps up for 4 more years, I think I published that in 2007, we're going to run out of people. I mean, you can't keep wiping out 14% per year, and which was the attrition rate, but we were experiencing other things. So, yeah, that was our wake up call right there as a church.
Okay, so it's about 2005 or so, or is that if I have the timeline right
Exactly.
there?
Yeah, yeah.
It's about
2005,
2005.
2006.
You have your entire ministry experience has been you grew up son of a pastor, you pastored in traditional churches where you have the church building and you have Sunday
Yep,
services and you have
yep,
staff
yep,
and you have
yep.
all of this. And then you are facing a situation in which that model is not working for you. And
That's right.
so
Something really needs to change.
there's a number of options, one of which is you could have quit, one of which is you could have kept doing it until the thing eventually closed, but you chose a
Right.
different option or you ended up with a different model. How did that move from traditional to non-traditional happen and how did you begin to step into that space?
Well, let me back up just a half a step, because the third option was that we could have moved out to, more out to the
Yes.
suburbs
Hmm.
again. Our church
Yeah.
had already moved twice. We
Okay.
had over its 75, well, it's 100 years old now, but we'd already moved, kind of staying. They didn't realize it, but they're staying ahead of the urbanization
Hmm.
wave,
Yeah.
is what they were doing. And it had worked well, but are we going to like what end up in British Columbia here before long, or or do we stop and say, "Wow, Jesus, you put us in this city, somehow we
Hmm.
need to figure out how to stay"?
Yeah.
So the first thing that we really did was I jumped into some grad work right then, because I knew I needed to hang out with some people that understood this way more than I did. So fortunately, I was able to start going back and forth over to the UK, the arm of the family of God that is a lot further around the post-Christian corner than we are, and they had a lot of answers. They were able to really breathe a significant amount of insight into us. But I came back and we shut down all of our church programs. We left our morning gatherings like they were, but we shut down everything else, and we took all of the human resource and said, rather than doing all of your volunteerism, we're going to meet on Tuesday nights at 7 o'clock, and we're just gonna pray, and we're going to start to think, and we're going to start to wrestle with how is it, Lord, that we can stay. We know that we could probably pick up and move, sell and move. We could probably pull that off. Plenty of our sister churches were already doing that. We're down to only 5 or 6 of our tribe left in the whole city at this point. So we knew we could do that, but how do we stay? Lord, you're going to have to show us how to stay. That was our prayer request going in. And but the Lord really met us I mean, not immediately. At first, it was very frustrating, but somewhere out of the fog, there came some very momentous surgeries in our soul, and we realized we had a consumer cancer about us that was killing us. We were dying from cancer, and our understanding of church was still pretty much all about us doing church like we liked it. And we were somehow brought to this place through a series of parables and a variety of things, but where we felt the Lord say, "Hey, you like doing your church your way. You've done it that way your whole life, but are you willing to do church for a different people in a way that they need, even if you don't like it? Are you willing to do church that way?" Now, that was a very varsity question for us, man, and we
Yeah.
were not ready for that. But we had to begin to wrestle with it and really begin to identify the profound numbers of people in our city that really were worldview profoundly different than we were. How do we do church for them? How do we exist to begin to introduce them to the Savior and grow them in the likeness of Christ? And it wasn't going to be, having everybody sit down and listen to me fire for 45 minutes and with a message that I've worked on all week, and then having our recording artist, worship leader get up with a really cool sounding band behind them and do all that. That was our language. That wasn't theirs.
Yeah.
So there was just a lot of meltdown needed, shall we say. And our
Yeah, so
group
you're
had
in
to
the
go,
midst of that space then. You're realizing what you have been providing, what you have been trained to provide, what you have been enculturated to provide is not what is needed.
all right,
I know the model you kind of ended up there, and we're going to talk about that, but how were you able to discern the direction to go in that
yeah,
moment? Because there's a lot of different things you could have done to try to potentially to adapt to the changing culture. What led you in this particular direction? Of course, at some point, I don't want people to hang on here any further without knowing what a dinner church is. So we're going to get there in a minute. But like, what led you in this specific direction? Because I can imagine a lot of different ideas could have been floating around at the time of the way that you could connect with
yeah.
this changed environment. Why this direction?
Yeah, there just there was like a move of the spirit a bit that was bubbling up in our heart about
Mm-hmm.
getting back to the table.
Yeah.
And I'd been studying a lot in my grad work that the apostolic era, they really understood the anointing of the table. The Christendom era, not so much. Here in this Reformation era that we've operated all, not at all. I mean, our only understanding of the table is the occasional fellowship meal, and it was just helping the family be more the family. But understanding some of the origins for the sake of the table, we were a long ways from that, and we just had these spirit promptings as we prayed, go back to the table. We were looking at the parable of the great feast, and once again, it's if you got room in the house, which I think this is a wonderful leadership directive that Jesus left for all time. If you have room in the house, start looking at different people than what you already have, and to a table, to a big table. And so we got kind of sociological rather than just theological on some of these kinds of topics. There was a practicality the Lord seemed to speak into us for stuff that we
Yeah.
had previously just theologized. But now it was like, well, actually, you need to understand the table. You're in a very similar kind of environment that Rome was back in the day when Jesus came. And so their understanding of the table kind of matches the high levels of secularization and isolation and the stuff that really makes up big cities. And so we just, but I will say we resisted it at first because we put a lot of money and a lot of time into learning the other
Yeah.
models that would really impress
Absolutely.
our friends and family whenever they came to visit. And
Uh
this
huh.
wasn't necessarily going to do that, probably.
Yeah. All the classic, so all the sort of like cool measures of success were not. You were like you're basically saying, well, I guess we're not going to be doing those, so we're gonna,
Melody,
which
Melody said, "Yeah, dinner church is not sexy. It's highly
yeah.
impactful with the people that are not in church right now, but it's not sexy."
Which, I mean, when you think about it at a larger scale level, at the level of the church, is a whole other complicated question. Like, because what's the most effective ought to be most most
Yeah,
attractive.
that's
But
the way we think. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's the way we think.
so okay, we've talked around it, but let's get to it. What is a dinner church, Verlon? Like, what is the model? What is it? What does it look like? Talk to us about that.
Well, a dinner church is a recovery project more than a model. And once we started to look at it that way and recognize just how table-centric the first church was, and the kinds of downloads from heaven that would happen at a table that would not happen equally in other social spaces and times. And I started to fully understand that. That became really a challenge to me. So, okay, if this is a recovery project, here we are 2,000 years down the road. We've got limited info to deal with. There's actually a lot more about the Jesus tables than what we, unless you go researching for it, you don't know how much is there. There's actually a lot there, which I then went researching for it. And I was just kind of blown away at how is it that we know so little about this when there's actually quite a lot written. So as I begin to unpack all that information as a recovery discipline, that was where our understanding of how to do this came from. It came a lot more from Tertullian's vast writings. It came from really looking at the New Testament again through sociological eyes in their day, not just theological eyes from our day, and really pack all that together. So, in the first Holy Week, Jesus took the big meal event, the Passover, and right in front of their eyes, he extracted the central remembrance of their rescue from Egypt, and he put himself back in. And of course, the Passover it was laced with very deep meaning associated with you grab the familyless and the isolated and the disconnected, and you get them to the table and you eat together and you remember God's dramatic rescue from Egypt, what he did for
Yeah.
the people. But Jesus changed that last part, but he didn't change the meal of I didn't change the invite list and all of that. So what the disciples heard that night after Jesus put himself in as the central remembrance event going forward is, you grab the family list, you pull them to the table, you eat together with them, and then you talk about me. You remember me. And on that night, it became the new Passover, if you will. I think more and more authors are actually now just using that unabashedly, that language. From that night on, it was a new Passover. It was a new covenant. It was a new way
Hmm.
of going forward. And it was no longer an annual meal event. It was whenever you get together,
Yeah.
do this.
As often as you do this in remembrance of me, you know?
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
It turned daily at that point or whenever they got together. So that explains why the book of Acts was immediately to the table and why the table was so very centric in their definition of Christian gatherings and the way they would evangelize, the way the place that they would heal, they would breathe life, even the full gifts of the Lord at work among the people. It was tableside. As they were eating together, all this stuff is going on. So so we picked that up and said, all right, well, those are the three theological immovables, if you will, where you're gathering the disconnected at all different sorts of the economic ladder. We're not homeless. It's like everybody. The Zacchaeus is the great story that Jesus gave the greatest information of the back and forth at a table, and yet he was very wealthy. But you're at the table there and you're eating together, and then you're remembering Jesus. You're beginning to tell the Jesus stories, those 468 electrifying narratives that defined the apostolic era's version of preaching. We have superimposed assumptions upon them that I'm not really sure fit well. What they were actually doing, they were electrified with those Jesus stories. And that's what they preached. In fact, the last book that I put out is all about unpacking the research on what it was they actually preached and what we think
Oh,
they
okay.
preached. Kind of a
Yeah.
comparison between the two.
Hmm.
So there was just the Jesus tables that were of the new Passover in nature, but with the Jesus stories preaching, the story form with authority version of preaching that Jesus actually introduced to the earth and that his disciples totally picked up on. That became our model, right? That became our understanding of the theology. So dinner church for us is a theology.
Hmm.
And what everybody does beyond that is their contextual work in this neighborhood versus that in this city, small town, big town, because now they're happening all over the country. So
Yeah.
everyone looks really pretty different because their context is
Well,
begging for
let's
difference.
let's quantify it a little bit. So in the context you started, urban
Mm-hmm.
environment, Seattle,
Mm-hmm.
what
Mm-hmm.
does a community dinner or a dinner church gathering
Yeah.
community, what does that look like right now today?
So each one will be quite different. I mean, we have one that happened this week that was down in Pike Market, and that's a big
Okay.
one. And
Yeah.
we have another one that is happening tonight, actually, in an apartment building up in Lake City. And those two are pretty radically different. You can imagine the people groups are very different. Their versions of isolation are different. But in general, everyone is going to walk into a room. There's going to be a buffet table that has more food than the group can possibly eat. And we understand that as the gospel. It's a metaphor of the gospel, the food is. And so it needs to be, both free and, more than you need, but it's all
Abundant.
there.
Yeah.
Abundance, that's the word, abundance. So the visuality of that is always pretty impressive. That
Hmm.
that sense of, wow, this is really a great meal. This is not stuff that we're getting from leftover food banks. This is okay. This is the gospel in visual form. We've got worship people that are up front already beginning to sing or lead in worship music. Same kind of thing we would have on a Sunday morning, just they'll be doing a lot more of it. And people aren't singing with them usually. Some do, but they're just up front, just filling the room through music and worship with the presence of Jesus. They're presencing Christ in the space is what they're doing. And the tables are decorated well. We want people to know that you guys are really loved and taken care of. There's not plastic tables here. I mean, this is going to be an event for the neighborhood. This is a big heartbeat every single week for this
Yeah.
neighborhood. And it's a time for all of us to come together and be together.
Mm.
And yeah, we're going to talk about Jesus, but there's just this huge koinonia moment that is happening with everyone.
Yeah.
And so people are grabbing their food, they're sitting down, they're talking about anything under the sun. And some of it's even maybe a little off color, but that's their life. That's the way
Yeah.
that's the way
Yeah.
they live.
It's honest, in
And
other words.
it's
Yeah.
honest. It's
Yeah.
absolutely honest.
Hmm.
And the
Yeah.
worship music is going on. And at some point in time, the pastor of that church is going to stand up and thank everyone for being there. Those that brought money to help pay for this. We're a self-sustaining community here. We take care of one another. This is our neighborhood's, big table, if you will. And anyway, but tonight I'm going to focus on the story from the life of Christ, and then they'll introduce it, and then for about the next 10 minutes, not much longer than 10 minutes, but a 1 point story form with authority message from that one story for that evening. And then usually, and they might jump out and say, hey, same thing happened to the Apostle Paul. Or maybe, hey, and when David, I mean, so it's not that the rest of Scripture is in any way out of bounds. It's just everything connects back to the Jesus story in very thick form. And there is just this very solid understanding that as we are telling the Jesus story, Jesus is beginning to introduce himself to the listeners. That's sort of like the deal between heaven and earth. You guys go and you be witnesses to me. In other words, you tell my stories, and then
Yeah.
I'm going to do stuff with that's kind of beyond your work and beyond your imagination. And so while we are telling those stories, Jesus is at work, absolutely introducing himself, not as a historical figure, but as live right here, looking at you from inside of you, as mysterious and miraculous as that might be. But those divine introductions are happening on a regular quantum basis. That's the power of the Jesus stories preaching. And as we just are laying that out, there is stuff working in the divine that is both healing, it's powerful, it's just, you know, you're real. I
Yeah.
came to hear about Jesus, the historical figure, and now all of a sudden you're like talking to me and I'm talking to you, and this
Yeah.
is crazy. I mean, we get all those comments a lot when people suddenly are becoming very real time, face to face in their friendship with Jesus. So that's what Jesus Stories preaching does. That's why it's so profound, and especially in a Great Commission environment like a dinner church that's really right out on the front lines of the gospel. That's the stuff, the way, how the sausage is made, so to speak. But that is the very real stuff that is bringing people to an understanding of Christ as a dear friend. And then we just go back to eating. Usually the pastor, when he's done preaching that message, will talk about how this particular story changed their life so much. And if you're
Yeah.
messing with a story that didn't change your life, go get another one, you know? Don't tell that one. Go get one
Yeah,
that has
go get
messed with
another one.
you, that
Yeah.
has fixed
Mm-hmm.
you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell a story that's fixed you, because that's what you're going to end with. And man, my wife and I, and this and that and the other, and this story, and sheesh, I went and humbled myself to her, because this story just like, you can't keep doing that, you know? And so really personalize how it has improved and fixed things in your life, and how it's pushed out things that have been ruining your life and brought in things that are now really and lifting your life. And so then they'll pray just this big, huge, unapologetic Armenian prayer over everyone afterwards, because there's just this big arms of the Lord at work. So we might as well go ahead and pray like it at that point. So then afterwards, people go back to talking, and sometimes they go right back to talking about the Seahawks, but a lot of times they go back to talking about, so you really believe that Jesus walked on water. That's not like a myth. You really believed he walked on water.
Mm. Yeah.
How do you believe that? You know, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Yeah.
you've got interesting collisions of rationalisms versus
Mm-hmm.
faith understandings with regards to the life of Jesus. And when all of them are dovetailed right into one of those 468 Jesus stories, I mean, they're right there. And when we're talking about a historical figure, it's somehow bookends the conversation in some most powerful ways. So the discussion gets pretty electric.
Well, I believe that, especially in a secular progressive city like Seattle,
Right,
very
right.
can go a lot of different directions and a lot of different ways. Like what I have a number of different questions we could go with, but one question I'll ask right now is, like, obviously there's a lot of different communities dinner churches are in, but
Mhm.
in the community with which you're most familiar in Seattle, like, how would the local community describe what's happening there? Like, people who know about it or have come a couple of times, how do they understand what's going on there, and how would they? I mean, if two community members that don't know you were talking about the dinner church, how do you think they would describe
Mhm.
it to each other? Hey, what's going on over there? Oh, let me tell you, that kind of thing.
Yeah. We were concerned that we were crossing lines of bait and switch kind of stuff, things of that
Hmm.
nature.
Yeah.
And what we realized really early on is that there is a huge interest, even in secular Seattle, in the person of Jesus. What the suspicion is organized religion, the church, which kind of comes down to our way of doing church, our Reformation era's version of bringing everybody in, spending all of our resources on ourselves,
Proclamation
that
based,
kind of
that kind of thing.
proclamation. Yeah. And, somebody standing up for 45 minutes and telling me what to think rather than a dialogue. What we've offered
Yeah.
is monologues, and
Yeah.
that's our norm. But what they need a dialogue. They need to talk stuff over. And that's just one of the sociological misalignments that we realized is happening in secular and isolated America, is that they do not like the monologue thing. Don't tell me what to think and then send me home. Are you kidding? 45 minutes and then send me home. So there is a
For those of us
very
who get to tell
major,
people what to think, it feels pretty good for us, but maybe not for
it's
anybody
fun.
else.
Works for us. Yeah. Yeah. And the Christians, those with the hold a strong Judeo worldview, it works for
Hmm.
all of them.
Hmm.
We like it. I mean, we sit there,
Yeah.
we're blessed like crazy when a good teacher of the word gets up and just unpacks it and
Yeah. Come
unfolds
on.
it. And
Yeah.
yeah, I absolutely love it. But then again, the large portion of the population holding to
Yeah.
a secular worldview, they don't get that at all.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, uh, okay, let me ask you this question. Obviously, this is a very different. You've probably read the book "Models of the Church" by Dulles, right? Have you
Oh
familiar
yeah.
with that
Yeah.
book at
Yeah.
all?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We
So,
actually use it to teach. Yep.
so proclamation and then like church as sacrament or church as servant is probably where this model kind
Mhm.
of fits there. When you think about the dinner church theology and the implementation of that theology, and you think about and that model, if you will, and you think about the traditional church, like I attend Venture Church in Mill Creek, which is very much a suburban kind of traditional proclamation church, lots
Yep.
of other
Yep.
things,
Very
lots
effective
of our
one.
other
Yep.
churches. What is the relationship between those two kinds of models in the larger kingdom? Like how does that work and fit together?
In our particular case, of course, we are one church that has completely bought into the
Hmm.
dinner church
Yeah.
theology.
Hmm.
But when you have other churches that are doing dinner churches, they actually have a traditional congregation that has wanted to reach people that they haven't been reaching well. So they open up a dinner church congregation and they love them both. Jesus gave us these Judeo peoples to usher to heaven, and we're going to keep doing that on Sunday. But Jesus also gave us another congregation, and that's this group over here that are wired completely different. We do on Tuesday nights, we're around tables. It's a big feast, and but we love and take care of them as an equal congregation too. And so there is just an awful lot now across the country. There's, in excess of 1,000 of them across the country, but there's just like it's a big adoption process where a traditional Sunday group they kind of lost their sense of mission. They know they're kind of living way too much unto themselves. And yet the Lord opens up their eyes for another dinner church congregation in waiting only a few blocks. And somewhere in the spirit, they hear the Lord say, "Hey, do you guys want this? Because I'd love to give you this baby over here." And they go, "We'll take it." And in that way, they grab a hold of that version of the church that's a couple thousand years old, and they treat it as a recovery, and they go get it. And so the relationship between the two of them is really beautiful. It's really
Hmm.
needful. It's like the people and the resources of the traditional is what allows the dinner church to take off. But then the dinner church and its fiery frontlines mission reminds the traditional church how to actually how they're supposed to be functioning. So they arise and go after those that they can reach in a far higher sense. And so we had one large initiative that we did, one of our first out of town ones. This was clear back in like 2017. Was it in Florida, and they opened up 55 dinner churches, all in one denomination. And I was just with the leader of that, the district leader, just last week at our dinner church summit, national summit. He said what he found is that of those churches that had opened up, the 55 dinner churches as second congregations, their Sunday church took off on a growing spurt, not from the people from the dinner church. The dinner church
Interesting.
did not drift over because they have they're sociologically wired different. They're never going to really
Yeah.
like that. Sit down, be quiet, and listen to what I got to say to you. But there's a bunch of other folk out there that still like that and want that and need that. And so the vision and the fieriness of the dinner church really re-inspired the core, and they took off on a whole new sense of mission too. And I loved that feedback. That was really cool to hear. I knew that was happening. In fact, I told everyone this is probably going to happen in our trainings, but to have a district superintendent having taken score, out of these
Yeah.
55 churches, and watched it absolutely happen was just a beautiful feedback for us. So that's the relationship. There is a
Okay.
needfulness here,
Yeah.
a
So
respect,
one
a mutual
question.
respect.
Yeah, I want to pick up on a piece of language you've used there because we've either talked about this before or I've read this in something you've written, but you very specifically use the word dinner church congregation as opposed
Mhm.
to doing a bunch of dinners as a side ministry of an existing proclamation church. And I think you've talked about that or written about that before. Can you talk about the difference
Yeah.
between doing dinner church as a ministry of the church and actually its own congregation?
Well, if you do something as an outreach or a ministry, it automatically has about a 5-year shelf life on it. Because for years, the church has been doing ministries and outreaches, and that tends to be what happens. It kind of burns on its own steam. But if it is, in fact, a congregation, and it is a full-blown church of its own right, in other words, it is fully capable of shaping its people in the likeness of Christ, then it's not a ministry and it's not an outreach. It is a church. And when you treat it like a church, it gets the full pastoral attention. It gets the full investment, the full discipleship, everything that a very sober pastoral leader would do when Jesus said, "Hey, I want you to take care of this flock of mine and nurture them in my likeness." The same soberness that we would do with a Sunday group, we do the same thing with our dinner church, treating it as such. And it's another version of the bride of Christ. So when we treat it that way, we're not shutting them down in 3 or 4 or 5 years like so many of our outreaches.
So, another related question, and I think you and I have talked about this before. I think some folks, and you've probably picked up on this potential critique, some folks looking at the dinner church theology or concept or the way that it operates might say, is this, I'm being devil's advocate here, so don't be mad at me. Is this
Sure,
really a
sure.
church? Like, does this have all the
Right.
marks of a full church that performs ordinances, that has the marks of the church, that does discipleship? Ecclesiologically, so to speak, to use the technical term, is this a full church? Is there something missing that a church that a full church community for the Christian believer needs or should have? I'm sure you've probably had questions like that. And how do you think through that
Yeah.
as that question comes up?
Well, historically, this version of church that we've been practicing the last 500 years was given to us by the reformers, the classroom style, face forward, the 1 hour, biblical dialogues from up front and all of that. It's a relative newcomer in church history in terms of that form. We've been practicing for the last 500 years, something that was only invented 500 years ago. And we haven't really stopped to think, wait, this didn't come from the Bible. This came from the
Hmm.
reformers.
Yeah.
And so, you know, to be asking the question in general from our particular stand as though we are on the solid biblical theological center questioning something that doesn't look like that is a very it's misrepresenting church history writ large. And the other thing I would answer from a theological angle, though, is that almost every denomination has the belief that if we have worship and fellowship and discipleship and evangelism and compassion as the purposes of a church, then spiritual development theory is that the people that are a part of that, if there's an equidistant approach of all five of those, their life is going to become looking an awful lot like Jesus himself. There's going to be a Christ-like formation if those five things are working really well. And some denominations say it in 8, some say it in 3, and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But that around those five spiritual foundations, if you will, that is what makes a church a church. A church is able to fully shape someone in the likeness of Christ. And if those five things are occurring, this is denominational speak for a long time, by the way, but if those five things are occurring, then that's the product that we're going to get. That's what makes what we do at church, even if honestly, we're not very good at some of them. Nonetheless, at least in theory, we're trying to be. At least some are trying to be. Most are trying to be. But at dinner church, it gets very high marks on all five of those. And I would say with far less effort than what it took to make all five of those continue to operate flawlessly in the traditional setting. And I had 26 years in the traditional thing before we crossed the line into the. So I really do. I know how hard it is to get
Yeah.
people into a discipleship
Yeah.
class rather than just be sitters and listeners. And I know the battle. And so, but at dinner church, I mean, the worship, the focusing on the life of Christ,
Hmm.
and the discipleship that's happening around the tables, it's conversational as opposed to sit down in a class and, the more teaching based stuff that we've been used to, but it's still fully there. The compassion, oh, that's easy. They're the people that have great need are always finding their way into our rooms, and we're so glad to have them. It's so Christ-like to welcome them in a great way. And so then the teaching and every aspect that makes a church is operating. And then the evangelism part is the part that a table is so natural at, that our traditional churches are struggling so much to get anything happening in evangelism. And so that's that in and of itself is where the dinner church scores instantly, and very high marks on in a very um, surprising way.
Verlon, what I love about the ministry that you've been serving in this work and this theological sociological approach is that well, I'm sure you were at certain points, but at the same time, it represents a certain willingness to say, let's try something different. Let's see what works. Let's see where the Spirit is leading. I think one of the things is, I'm a church historian, and one of the things that I mention in sometimes at the beginning of a church history class is I say, church history teaches us that we haven't always done things the way we do right now, which means we don't have to keep doing things the way we are right now.
Yeah.
And we can do things differently. And it feels wrong in the moment. It feels wrong to
Yeah.
do things differently because we are so used to this one way. And I think it's
Status
very
quo
important.
speaks so loud.
Yeah, and it almost carries the weight of like moral weight, like, or ethical or theological weight, when really it's just what's familiar, It's
Yeah.
just what's
Yeah.
familiar. And I think
So
being
well
and
said.
sometimes you do run into theological walls, obviously. Sometimes you do run into things, but let's ask the question why. Let's ask the questions, what can we do different to carry the mission forward? So
Yep.
um,
Yep.
I have maybe two more questions for you. One is connected to a mutual friend of ours, Don Ross,
Oh
who
yes.
has been telling me about some exciting things happening with the dinner church movement nationally. I'm in places like Pennsylvania, Delaware, Ohio, Montana. And I'd like to hear
Right,
about that. But
right.
also, I'd just like to hear in the last few decades, like because you started this, you thought about this, you conceived of this, the Spirit led you to this in a very specific context, urban
Right.
Seattle in the Pacific Northwest.
I
And
thought this was
also,
just for our church.
yeah, and also the movement has taken place in rural places and other states and other situations. So, what have you learned from what God is up to in these different places, and then particularly what is happening right now? Like, where's the leading edge of what Dinner Church is doing at the moment?
Well, that last question. I want to start there because the leading edge has about several edges.
Okay, yeah,
There's
leading
not a
edges.
leading edge.
Yeah,
One that is very surprising is how many small churches across the country are being directed by the Lord to adopt one of these dinner church congregations in waiting and bring it to the fore. And then that dinner church is outnumbering their Sunday church within the first year. Like in Montana, for instance, every single dinner church congregation outnumbers its host. And and I think I did a training there 2.5 years ago. And in that period of time, that has become a very interesting reality. There is one church in Wichita, right outside of Wichita, Kansas. It's a church of 40 that really felt directed by the Lord to give themselves to resetting the Lord's table for people. They've now opened up their ninth dinner church, a congregation of 40 with 9 separate dinner church congregations every week, most of which that outnumbers their group of 40 on Sunday. And the whole church is just like, this is what we are. This is our mission. This is what we
yeah,
do. We set the table so Jesus can have dinner with all kinds of people that don't want to come be with us on Sunday, and we have no problem with it. And so that's one cutting edge. Is it's a it's a version of church planting that small churches can do and they can afford. And they quite frankly need to, a lot of them, because they have kind of lost their sense of mission. They're just kind of holding on, hoping that they don't lose a few more people. And then, they're just kind of in that difficult stall. So it's very, very beautiful for that. I think another real cutting edge part is churches that are in larger cities or larger areas. They're beginning to get a map for the whole city. And they're beginning to see, wow, there's a congregation in waiting. There's one, there's one, there's one, there's one, there's one, there's one.
yeah,
And so then they're grabbing a hold of sister churches and saying, hey, will you come? That one is only 2 blocks from you. Can we help you? And so in other words, they are creating entire initiatives, dinner church planting initiatives that are multi-congregational, multi-denominational. And what we do here in Seattle, where we've got so many other congregations involved, the 18 that we have up and running right now, is like it is a whole citywide dinner church planting initiative that's kind of
okay,
in the ilk of Acts 5. Man, you've spread this gospel through the whole city. Well, we know they were doing that table to table. That's how they did that. And so we're just watching those things happen all across the country where someone gets onto it, they open up a dinner church, it becomes so electrifying to their whole group. And so then, well, yeah, but what about that neighborhood? That one, I can't even
yeah,
sleep at night, And so then suddenly a bunch of people are rushing into that. Well, what about that one? And they're starting to
hmm,
spread this gospel through the whole city and the whole region. So that's another real exciting edge. And then a third one that is really grabbing my attention in a very huge way is we have a place up in Lake City where we have a dinner church in an apartment building right now that is just, boy, the miracle stories that are coming out of that church are riveting. I mean, divine healings left and
wow,
right
wow,
around this table. Well, we
hmm,
were up there,
yeah,
took our board and their spouses up to pray in that neighborhood, and we turned around, and here was this old, dilapidated church building that had been fenced off. It hadn't had any people in it for a long time. In fact, we found out from one of our board members that it was actually owned by the car dealership, and they use it to store parts. But it had been one of our denomination's buildings way back before Melody and I moved here in '99. And so I took a picture of it, and then I looked at the picture on my phone, and right behind it, about 300 yards back was this big apartment complex. And I just felt the Lord so plainly go, yep, past and future. You see that? This church building is the way that it was, but I've opened up how many of these buildings for you? And it was like, so we took the whole board and we walked over to that, and it's a monstrous building, probably 400 and some odd units. And we prayed in front of it. And within 2 weeks, we had one of our board members come and say, "Hey, actually, my relative is the friends with the manager in that building. And if we want to get in there, so
Yeah.
in our city, we have way more invites to bring your dinners in and do what you do here than we have people to do it. We've got a leadership crisis right now that is numbering. I mean, literally, I could put 100 people to work in the city if we had them. But that's why that real big prayer request, pray for the Lord of the harvest to send laborers, because if you're understanding this thing accurately, that's the problem you're going to have really fast, is laborers to do all the work. You're going to see the field, and the opportunities to get into that field are going to be very practical, and they're going to be very, when are you going to come, And so that to me is, we have way more open doors and invites right now than we actually have dinner churches in the city. And but we just don't have the workers to get at them right now. We're working hard at that. That's our big challenge. So those are the three vistas, if you will,
Okay. Yeah.
of growth in the front edge. I am really excited to see the Assemblies of God denomination, the largest Pentecostal denomination, and one of them that I think the rest of the denominational world, of which I work and coach and travel in many of them, they look at the Assemblies of God as the one that still hasn't started to shrink. And so they're like, okay, all of us have started to decline. We're closing churches left, right. And you guys are still finding some momentum, and you're big. You have 13,000 churches across the
Hmm.
country.
Yeah.
And so the rest of the body of Christ is kind of waiting for the Assemblies of God to say, yeah, let's all do this together. I mean,
Hmm.
they really are waiting for our inspiration, if you will. But right here in the Northwest, Don Ross, you mentioned him, the superintendent here in the Northwest Ministry Network, has been very verbal about the opportunity of winning back a Jesus table with Jesus stories
Mm.
version of church. And we've opened up, I don't know, 50 some right here in Washington, 18 of them here in the city of Seattle. But
Yeah.
so he's been telling his other superintendent friends, and so before long, Montana started to click on, and he's introduced
Hmm.
me to Wyoming and New York, and I mean, there's just been a lot of
Yeah.
conversations. But last year, that was when one of the most influential networks, the Pindell district,
Okay.
they're kind of in a location that everyone really pays attention to what Pindell is doing, and they're pretty big and they're pretty prolific. But when they brought us in to come to a district council and speak, and then start doing trainings and opening them up, there was a massive response.
Wow.
They had 70 churches show up to their first training. And it was a day conference version of training, which is just a remarkable
Yeah.
percentage.
Well, and I'm from New Jersey, so southern New Jersey, right, not too far from Philadelphia.
Yeah,
So
right,
certainly in some of
right.
those areas, like the urban centers, like a Philadelphia, seems like ready made for
Uh,
something like this. And I know this,
yep,
I know
yep.
this happens at a lot of
Pittsburgh.
different settings, but some of those urban places, absolutely. Yeah.
And the thing that they're focused on is the troves of small Rust Belt towns that has
Mm.
one or two churches
Yeah.
left, that is drained down to 10
Hmm.
people and a dog,
Yeah.
and they have no money to open up anything else. And so they're saying, wouldn't it be great to have a dinner church congregation happening in each one of those drug infested, opioid infested towns, and get life happening back. So that's and then Ohio did the same thing. Ohio had a really large initiative that has started to really arise in the AG, and many more things are right online. I mean, like weeks from now, I'm with a number of other leaders to talk about what a dinner church wave is. The one that's coming to you. It's not something you're going to choose. It's going to show up on your shores. The only question is, how well are you going to surf it? Because
Exactly.
it is stepping into the void,
I
to
love
be
it.
sure.
So, Verlin, our time is just about up here. If someone has just heard you share a little bit, maybe they've heard about Dinner Church for the first time, Where are some places on the internet, or how can people learn more about Dinner Church, or
Great
find more
question.
about things you've written,
Yeah,
things you've spoken, or get in contact with you?
yeah. Well, communitydinners.com is the
Okay.
Seattle connection point. So
Okay.
if you're really interested and say, man, I live in Seattle, or I want to come in, I want to come visit an urban dinner church, jump on there, and all the sites are listed. You can pick what times and places, and and if you want to throw, if for some reason you want to give up your life for the city, we can put you to work by yesterday. So
Yeah.
if you're genuinely stirred by church planting in an urban
Hmm.
environment, please reach out to us. We're
Yeah.
desperate to put people to work and be able to say yes to all of these requests that are coming at us. And I do mean that. We really are desperate for this. The other website though is dinnerchurch.com, and that's how it is that we actually work with ministers and churches around the country. That's our coaching and the Dinner Church Collective Network that helps people really begin to know. And I've got a number of written resources there. There's videos that you can
Great.
jump in. There's
Great.
a whole lot of conversations around the water fountains where at a certain time dinner church leaders and teams from all over the country will converge at a moment, and it all opens up and you all just kind of help each other in, well, we discovered this and we discovered that, and all that kind of thing. So and then there's just a flood of training opportunities that are available there, some virtual, some in person, but that all happens at dinnerchurch.com.
Terrific. Excellent. Well, I'll put that in the notes for the show so people can take a look at that. Last
Great.
question for you, Verl, I ask most of my guests this question. Let's say you have 30 seconds or so and a room full of 10,000 pastors. What would you say to them if you had 30 seconds? What would you
If
want
I
to?
had 30 seconds, I would say the apostolic era understood the anointing of the table in ways that the church hasn't been practicing for 1700 years. What does that mean to us? What does the authority and the anointing of the table that we haven't been using, how meaningful might that become for us to consider bringing that back, recovering that ancient, that historic theology? What might that mean?
Questions, and I appreciate the conversation today and the ministry you've jumped into and have been serving in, Verlon. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Joshua.
And thanks everyone for listening to Live Long and Pastor.